You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and I'm Chevy Lynn Vasky with the K-State Radio Network. K-State agronomists Lucas Haag and Tina Sullivan start the show with important considerations and measures for irrigating crops and discuss what impacts improper timing can have on yields. Crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth continues the show as he shares recent concerns with armyworms across crops in Kansas. We round out today's show with K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk, who talks about data collected by the Federal Milk Marketing Order, which shows the difference between the price farmers are paid for fluid milk and what consumers pay at the store. That and more is coming up ahead on this episode of Agriculture Today. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with K-State agronomist Lucas Haag and Tina Sullivan. Thank you both for taking the time to join us today.
You bet.
Yes, thanks for having us.
As the irrigation season is coming to an end, can you explain what producers are able to do to help improve their water productivity?
When it comes to our irrigation season, we have been pretty fortunate throughout portions of the state getting some pretty timely rain for that grain fill period in corn or finishing up in corn. But that's really been some of our eastern portions of the state, whereas portions of western Kansas, and Lucas can speak more on this, might have missed some of those more timely rains. When we're thinking about some of our other crops, we might be still lagging a little bit behind on filling our grain fill period. But when we're thinking about the end of the season, we want to get the most crop per drop. So making those applications make the most sense. So applying when it makes the most sense and not applying it when the crop doesn't need it.
Yeah, so there's really an opportunity here, especially, for our producers that are operating within LEMA constraints and trying to minimize the water they're using on this growing cycle, is making sure that, we kind of coast on out the year here with enough to make sure we finish that crop, as Tina mentioned, but yet that we're not over-applying and putting water on that's not going to benefit us.
Can you guys touch on what the consequences are of improper timing?
Well, so on the timing piece of this, certainly if we pull that water back too soon and we put that crop under stress as it's trying to complete grain fill, we can leave yield on the table. And so obviously we don't want to do that. And then the flip side of that is we don't want to be putting on excess amounts of irrigation more than what it's going to take to get the crop to physiological maturity, because that just ends up being water that we didn't need to pump. It can also create us other downstream issues, like at harvest time. Moist soils are more easy to compact. We're dragging 1,000, 1,300 bushel grain carts through these fields, and so not putting ourselves in a situation where we're not only wasting water, but opening the door to some downstream soil issues. We want to try and minimize that.
Quickly adding on to not just thinking about, water use, not wanting to waste water. We know it's not free to run those pivots, right? We don't want to waste energy, fuel, and all the associated costs.
So how can producers go about measuring their soil moisture?
Yes, there's, certainly one of the biggest things we've seen change over recent years has been the use of soil moisture probes, and there's a variety of those technologies out on the market. I really think for us, the probe technology is really critical in helping us make this end-of-season decision to get a feel for what's left in the profile. So we've got the higher tech methods, but also, just good old feel and touch or use of a soil probe or a ball rod, spending some time in the field, looking at where the crop is at developmentally versus what do we got left in the profile and matching up that with, what our anticipated needs are.
And can we break down a little bit what those needs are and water requirements for the crops?
So when we think about a lot of our crops, starting with corn, we think about that high water need at tasseling and silking. But as we kind of go through that grain filling period, blister is still our highest water need, and they're still our longest time before we hit maturity. And as we go through our dough and beginning to dent, and then through our half milk line to full dent, that water need decreases substantially. But we don't have no water need until we're pretty much at black layer, when those individual grains are finished and they're no longer asking for water from the mother plant, so to speak. And we can kind of think about that in that ideology of, as we're going through our later reproductive phases of each of our grain crops, the water need decreases. So as an example, with the corn, when we're at blister, we still may need 10.5 inches to maturity. But then as we go into dough, it's 7.5, beginning dent, 5. And then as we're going in R5 progression or the milk line, that drops to 2.5. So pretty much think about starting at the top of a roller coaster. We're going downhill at that point. We still need water. We're kind of quickly approaching that finish line. So corn is probably going to be our biggest water user, especially even late season. When we're going into grain sorghum, that mid-bloom stage is when we still need our highest water need, roughly 9 inches. But then as we go in from soft to hard dough, we go to 5 inches to 2 inches, black layer. Once again, we see that black layer because the seed is saying, I'm physiologically done. There's no more water coming in. I'm cutting myself off from the plant. Soybeans, I'm actually doing some work in this area. Soybeans are kind of a mishmash of when they need water, because when we think about the soybean plant itself, no single flower or pod are the same age. They're all at different maturities across the plant, across the field. So generally, that R4 or full pod is when we need still our highest water need at 9 inches. Going into beginning seed, we're dropping to 6.5. But we don't really see that major tapering off until we start seeing that die back of the leaf material and the seeds have taken on that water. And if we prematurely cut water back for soybeans, we're going to see wrinkled beans and poorer weights.
Pretty similar to soybeans. Once we start beginning maturity, we've got some yellowing of the canopy. The thing I'd mention is kind of the reoccurring theme, and of course this table is available as part of the update article. But, basically when we get to kind of that final stage of progression on all these crops, so on corn when we're a little beyond half milk, sorghum when we're at hard dough, beans and dry beans when we start yellowing that canopy, basically all those when we're kind of at that final stage before full maturity, all those have about 2 inches of water requirement left on them to go. And so we can think about, well, how are we going to fill that? And that's where, as we talked earlier, the probing, getting a feel for how much moisture do I have in the profile, what's the forecast look like, but, ensuring that we've got enough to cover that final 2 inches of use when we're in that final growth stage on these crops.
What are the steps that producers can use to help decide the final irrigation time?
Yeah, so that's why we talk a lot about, getting, using the water probe technology, boots in the field, doing some probing, because using dates is actually a pretty poor way to decide when we're going to do that final irrigation. And so actually some work that was done out here at Colby over a pretty long time period, and this would be an irrigated corn, found that in order to hit maximum yield, the earliest date, there's some years that actually could have terminated irrigation on August 12th, and other years, really, we needed to be all the way out till about September 21st. And so there's kind of this old rule of thumb that, we'll terminate, at least out in western Kansas, we'll shut the wells off on Labor Day weekend. Well, on average, that's not bad, but we certainly can see some pretty wide swings away from that. And as we discussed earlier, we don't want to be too early because that means we're potentially leaving yield on the table, and we don't want to be too late because that means we're wasting energy and water. And so anyway, we don't really want to think about it as a date. We really want to make sure we're doing some scouting, using the technology if we have it to help us hone in on, an analogy I use is we're basically, there's two types of people in this world, right, when it comes to their fuel tanks in their cars. They either keep them full all the time or they're coasting on fumes. And we're trying to be somewhere in between. We're really trying to coast into the end of this season with about 50% available water, really no more or no less than that left in the root zone of the profile. And so that's what we're trying to do, is just coast into the end of the season, hitting that mark.
Is there anything else that you would like for producers to know?
Well, we mentioned, like I say, having too much water in the profile can lead to compaction issues at harvest. The other thing, at least on our deep silt loam soils, any water that's above about 60% field capacity, we've got slow drainage occurring over the winter, and so that water is going to be lost to deep percolation. And so that's something we want to be cognizant of. We want to make sure we leave some room in that profile, so if we catch good precip over the winter, we got somewhere to store that.
Can you remind listeners where they can find more information about this topic?
Yeah, so we've got a recent e-update article that really kind of pulls all this together and has a few other topics in here as well. And then within that, we offer links to, we have an extension guide, walking through the step-by-step procedure to kind of predict the final irrigation, as well as, how to determine soil water content by the touch and feel method.
Tina, can you touch a little bit about the indeterminate crops in Kansas?
So these are the ones that even though They're working on that vegetative stage, they're putting on the reproductive, but at the same time, they're still growing, right? When we think about corn or sorghum, once that silking and tasseling, that boot leaf has came out, they're done with their vegetative stages and they're going strictly into reproductive. Soybean and cotton are our two main indeterminate crops in Kansas. When we think of a single soybean plant, we may have flowers in varying stages. We may have pods in varying stages on the same plant, let alone across the field. Cotton is even more indeterminate because it is a perennial plant that we are growing like an annual crop. So we're always trying to trick cotton into thinking it's dying. When there's these different growth stages on a single plant, let alone across the field, it does make those water needs and the water use associated with our different stages a little bit harder to target, because it also requires more boots on the ground, kind of looking more into a field, see how the crop is progressing. In that soybean crop, I have heard a lot of farmers saying, we're going to stop irrigating at R1, R2, that early to mid flowering. And that's really not when the soybean needs its most water. It really needs the most water at that R4 to R5, filling out those pods and starting out those seeds. So if we're irrigating at the wrong times, again, we're leaving yield on the table. And we may actually lose a lot of flowers on cotton. So if you're walking the field, you may see a ton of cotton flowers on the ground. They're a very plastic crop where they're always trying to fill in the gap and do the best they can. So if we can water cotton around, I believe it's the candle stage, you're more likely to retain those flowers on the plant and finish them out.
Thank you both again for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having us.
Again, that was Kansas State University agronomists Tina Sullivan and Lucas Haag. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more for you later. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. Jeff, thanks again for joining us today.
My pleasure, anytime.
What kind of problems are we seeing with soybeans this year?
Yes, soybeans, number one, rain. It always helps get some moisture on all of our crops in a timely fashion. And, throughout the central part of the state, that seems to be one of the problems in the dryland beans, especially the double cropped. So, in many cases, we really need some moisture. Hopefully we're getting some soon, or I've always heard that August is the month that rain or moisture is critical to make your yield in soybeans, and I think that's really the truth this year. But there are some pests out there, as always. This time of year, soybeans and sorghum are our two crops that are actively growing and that pests can really affect. So, first of all, the soybeans, there's two different pests that I really worry about, and I've gotten a few calls on. Number one is the podworm, and number two is the adult bean leaf beetle. Now, I've gone over this many times, but I think it bears going over again. Podworms are corn earworms, cotton boll, whatever you want to call them. It's the same species. It's just a different crop. So the corn earworm's been feeding in corn. Once the corn dries down and matures, it can no longer feed in on the ears. The larvae can't. So when the adults come out as the moth flies around looking for some green succulent crop to lay their eggs on for their larvae to feed on. Generally, that's soybeans. If there's any soybeans in the area, and most of our soybeans are indeterminate, so they're continuing to put on some green succulent pods, or they can go to sorghum. But generally, the pattern in Kansas is they come out of the corn, they go to soybeans. As the soybeans dry down, then they may go to sorghum. It's all about timing. It's all about timing. Whether you treat and get good efficacy, it's mainly about timing and coverage. Anyway, the soybean podworm, corn earworm, whatever you want to call it, that can be devastating to the yield, because the worms, when the female moth lays the egg, she'll lay the egg on a leaf, but the little larvae will take a few bites of the leaf, and then they seem to head right for the pods. I don't know how they do it, but they figure out where the developing seed is, or the bean, whatever you want to call it, inside that pod, and they go right for that bean through the pod. And if there's, one seed, two seeds, three seeds normally are developing inside that pod, they will feed right on that seed, and they'll eat the seed, and they leave the pod. Okay, so if you're out in your field and you're scouting and you have a bunch of pods with one hole in them right where the bean is, or 2 or 3, that's the podworm. That's the kind of damage that they leave behind. Now, remember I just said they leave it behind. So if you're out looking and you can't find any of the larvae, any of the worms, don't spray. That means the feeding has pretty much been done. Generally, a day or 2 after they're through eating the seed out of the pod, that'll kind of turn brown or black around that little hole. So it's generally pretty easy to tell if it's an active site or not. But anyway, if you can't find any of the larvae, and generally you have to bend the plant over and vigorously shake it over a ground cloth or on the ground to find the larvae, because they're pretty good at hiding during the day. They're mostly nocturnal. So if you can't find any of the larvae, don't treat. That means those larvae pretty much are through feeding. Now, that's the difference between the bean leaf beetle adult and the corn earworm or the soybean podworm larva. They will feed for about 2 weeks, then they will crawl down into the soil and they will pupate. They'll pupate for 4 or 5 days, and then they will come out as an adult moth. They will mate, and then they will lay eggs, and those eggs will take 4 or 5 days to hatch. So it's going to be 2 to 3 weeks before there's another generation of larvae actively feeding on whatever it is, whether it's soybeans or whether the moth has flown on to sorghum or cotton or whatever. So if you find a bunch of holes in the pods, right, where the seeds were, that's indicative of corn earworms or soybean podworms. But if you don't find the larvae, that means they're not feeding there anymore. So don't treat. Hold up for 3 or 4 weeks, or at least 2 weeks. Go back out and resample them. Because what you want to do is find them when they're really small. You want to detect the larvae when they're just, that infestation is really, really small. They can do a number on the beans because they're just eating the seed inside that pod. So they can reduce your yield quite quickly. Now, the difference between the adult bean leaf beetle is that adult bean leaf beetle, they'll feed on the leaves, but as soon as those pods start developing and they're nice and green and succulent, they will start feeding on the pod. They don't feed on the bean or the seed inside the pod. They feed on the pod itself. So if you're out sampling and you find a bunch of pods with holes in them, scraped on them, but not just necessarily where the seed is, that's the bean leaf beetle adult. Again, bean leaf beetle adults are pretty shy and wary, so they're pretty difficult to count. They're going to be under the leaves or down in the shade or down at the bottom of the plant sometime during the day. So again, you have to vigorously shake the plants over a ground cloth and count the number of adults that you can. But they're feeding on the pod, not the bean inside the pod. Now, why is that important? Because, again, that opens up that pod for disease, or the seed can dry down or can fall out or whatever. So they're actually affecting the marketable product. They're actually affecting the yield. Why is it important to distinguish between the feeding of a corn earworm or a soybean podworm or a adult bean leaf beetle? The bean leaf beetle adults are going to overwinter as adults. So they're going to feed, as long as there are green pods in those fields, they're going to keep feeding on the pod. Not so the corn earworm larvae. They feed for 2 weeks, then it's 2 or 3 weeks later before the moth comes out, flies off and lays eggs. But the bean leaf beetles are going to stay out there in that field, and they're going to continue to feed on those pods as long as they're green. Once they start to turn brown, once they start to dry down a little bit, they'll quit feeding on them, and they'll maybe move to a later planted area of the field or a later planted field. But they're going to feed on those pods as long as there's any greenery attached to them at all. And then they're going to overwinter as adults. So once the beans dry down, they will fly to alfalfa, generally, is where they go. They'll maybe feed just a little bit on alfalfa leaves in late fall, not enough to cause any problems. But then a lot of times that's where we find them overwintering, is in the leaf litter or the residue on the ground in the alfalfa fields. So, and right now, both of these pests, both of these species can cause considerable loss quickly because they're feeding right on that marketable product. So just a word to the wise, get out and look and see what's actually out there in your field. And if you do decide you needed to treat, you can go to our KSU soybean pest management guides that's available on the website, or you can go to your local county extension agent, get a list of the products that are registered for use on either one of those pests, and good luck.
Are there any other pests, Jeff, that producers are seeing this year?
Well, there's one other one that is a problem every year, and that's the deck-leaf stem borer. It's in soybeans. The deck-leaf stem borer has been around. Well, they're native to Kansas. They've always been in sunflowers. They've caused problems in sunflowers. In 1985, for whatever reason, we found them in soybeans. So they transitioned into soybeans. You can still find them in sunflowers, but we did a big survey on native sunflowers. We couldn't find any in native sunflowers, but you can still find them in domestic sunflowers. But soybeans is what we mainly worry about. The deck-leaf stem borer, get out and look. Right now through August is when the larvae are actively feeding in the petioles. And as the month progresses, then they'll feed down towards the bottom of the plant, down towards the base. And as they go, they are aggressive. They're cannibalistic. So at the end of first part of September, you'll find one larvae per plant down at the base. They then will dig out their little route to the very base of the plant. They come back up and they girdle around the interior of the plant, which usually doesn't hurt yield unless the wind blows and the plant lodges. It'll blow the plants over. If you've not seen a soybean field lodged because of deck-leaf girdling just before harvest, it's a sick sight, and there's not much you can do about it. But right now, if you're out, you can see a dead petiole here, a dead petiole there on your plants. That is indicative of the borers inside tunneling down towards the base of the plant. So our only management strategy, we've tried a lot of different things, but our only management strategy right now is get out and check your fields. Make sure you can harvest those fields as early as possible before they, the fields that are mostly, that have a larger infestation of stem borers. Try and harvest those fields just as soon as you can, as soon as they mature enough to harvest and dry down, because we have storms in the fall, before they lodge and lose that yield. It's laying on the ground. Like I said, that is really kind of a sad sight when that happens. Kind of like when wheat lodges to Hessian fly, or corn. We used to have corn lodge to southwestern corn borer. All of those are when your plants are laying on the ground and you can't pick up the harvest. It's sad.
Jeff, thank you again for taking the time to join us today.
My pleasure, anytime.
Again, that was K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. We are cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more for you soon.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining us on Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Along with Chevy Lynn Vasky, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. The Class 1 milk base price and what consumers pay at the grocery store for bottled milk is not the same. The Class 1 base price is a minimum price set for fluid milk and is determined by a formula that varies across regions. The final price that consumers pay for fluid milk can be influenced by a variety of factors. This even includes promotions and discounts at grocery stores, along with transportation. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says that survey data collected by the Federal Milk Marketing Order from Denver, St. Louis, Kansas City, and Wichita provides some insight into the differences between the Class 1 base price and what consumers pay at the grocery store.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning what we've been seeing happen with our Class 1 base prices versus what people are actually paying for milk in the grocery store. Each year, the Milk Marketing Administrator here in the Central Order does a nice study looking at the differences in retail prices for homogenized milk versus what you receive under the federal order as a Class 1 price. Now, as we look at this data, there's a couple things that we need to recognize. This data just simply compares what the federal order Class 1 price was versus what the retail prices were in grocery stores as well as convenience stores. They picked 4 different cities to survey, so they survey the milk market in St. Louis, Denver, Kansas City, and Wichita. So as we look at the information, keep in mind that the processor pays more than just what is represented in the Class 1 federal price. So when we start looking at differences, just keep in mind this difference represents the difference between the federal order Class 1 price and the price sold in the grocery store. In addition, processors have several other charges that go against their profit margin. One of those would be overorder premiums that are charged by raw milk suppliers in order to get milk into plants. There's also costs associated with processing, packaging, marketing, sales, and also needed profit margins for the processor as well. So don't look at this as all just gross profit. So how do we actually compare? Well, it's interesting. There are some differences as you look at the percentage that the Class 1 price represented the overall average for retail homogenized milk in Wichita. That number typically has been about 60% or more. In recent years, though, that has fallen down to about 40%. So we look at the Denver market, it's been a little more steady, averaging pretty close to about 50%, although in 2024 was a little bit less than that. St. Louis market, only about 40% in 2024. And the Kansas City market, only about 30%. So as we look at those differences, why do we see those? Well, a lot of it has to do with the average retail price charged in these different cities. Kansas City has the highest retail charge for milk in the grocery store compared to the other 4 cities. Wichita generally averages less than St. Louis and Denver, although in 2024 was just a touch higher than the Denver market, St. Louis being a little bit higher than that. So, are you receiving a fair price for the milk that you produce on your dairy farm when you compare it to what consumers are paying for prices in the store? Well, I think that depends on how you want to look at that. Keep in mind that not all of our milk that we produce here in the Central Order is going to be in the jug. A lot of it is manufactured into other products. So that changes that percentage a bit, as a lot of times the prices that we receive for other classes of milk are less than what we would receive for Class 1. Do we see some differences in prices charged for milk across the cities surveyed? Yes, we do. Some markets elicit a higher price for that milk than others. It also could have to do with differences in retail grocery store usage as far as how they use milk as a loss leader in some situations to attract people into their grocery store. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Chevy Lynn Vasky, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.